October 24, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Just before dusk, the sea was calm and heavy with rain squalls drifting off Samar. To the west, the remnants of Japan's once proud combined fleet converged on the Philippines. To the east, the U.S. 7th Fleet prepared for a night that would test the limits of radar, gunnery control, and command coordination across hundreds of miles of ocean. The battleships of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf were about to demonstrate what happened when centuries of naval gunnery met the electronic age. The objective was not glory, it was geometry. Oldendorf's orders were clear. Block the Surigao Strait. Prevent Admiral Nishimura's southern force from entering Leyte Gulf and striking the invasion beaches. 6 U.S. battleships, many resurrected from Pearl Harbor, formed the core of a layered trap. Behind destroyer screens and PT boats, these vessels, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, would anchor a barrier that could sense and strike long before the Japanese could see them. Each ship carried its own nervous system of wires, dials, and cathode tubes. The SG and Mk8 fire control radars could pick up a target at over 20,000 yards, track bearing and range, and feed firing solutions directly to analog computers in the plotting rooms. It was a system of precision, not passion. The Japanese force, advancing through narrow straits under blackout, relied instead on optics and instinct, still fighting by line of sight in an environment where sight was fading. At 1800 hours, U.S. picket destroyers moved into position along the southern entrance of Surigao Strait. Radar watch officers scanned empty screens streaked with static. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Nishimura's column of battleships and cruisers was moving north at roughly 20 knots. Their goal: break through before dawn, disrupt the amphibious landings, and die if necessary in the attempt. Communications doctrine was deliberate and tight. Oldendorf's ships were linked through voice radio, TBS, talk between ships, and radar plotting reports sent in measured intervals. No one wanted to give away their position through chatter. The plan was classic naval strategy, almost textbook: crossing the T, the maneuver in which one fleet cuts across the head of another, bringing all guns to bear while the opponent can only fire forward. Yet this was not Tsushima or Jutland. This would be a radar war. As daylight faded, a tropical moon rose behind scattered clouds, its light quickly masked by drifting rain. Radar scopes hummed and adjusted. In 1900, the U.S. destroyers began to move. They would be the first contact, fast, expendable, but critical for the timing of the engagement. Every minute mattered. Oldendorf's line stretched across the northern mouth of the strait, like a silent wall of steel, each ship precisely plotted by radar range and bearing. The gunners did not yet know their targets, but the machines did. By midnight, the system was fully set. In less than 4 hours, Japan's southern force would enter the funnel. The first blips were only minutes away. October 25, 1944. Southern mouth of Surigao Strait. At 16 minutes past midnight, the first radar echoes appeared on the scopes of U.S. destroyers positioned south of Kanihayan Island. The range was just over 44,000 yards. Faint but distinct, the contacts moved steadily northward, multiple returns in a tight column. Within minutes, confirmation rippled up the chain. Admiral Nishimura's force had entered the strait. The U.S. line came alive in silence. The Japanese southern force consisted of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. Their formation was narrow, constrained by the geography of the strait. High ridges on both sides and shoals limiting maneuvering room. It was a funnel, and Oldendorf's fleet waited at the narrow end. The only path forward led directly into overlapping arcs of radar fire control. At 20 minutes past midnight, PT boats stationed along the entrance began their runs. They launched torpedoes from the dark, their wakes invisible, their radio reports clipped and calm. Enemy column sighted. Proceeding north. Most torpedoes missed or failed to detonate, but they achieved their real function, forcing the Japanese to alter course, compressing their formation further. By 1 o'clock, U.S. destroyer squadrons 54 and 24 advanced from both flanks. Their radar operators tracked the Japanese line as it closed within 20,000 yards. Commander Jesse Coward's division on the western side prepared for a torpedo strike. On the eastern flank, Commander Kenyon's ships mirrored the movement. Both would attack almost simultaneously, their timing coordinated by radar bearings rather than visual sightings. Inside the Japanese flagship Yamashiro, radar equipment was minimal, short range, unreliable, and often jammed by terrain. The crews relied on lookouts who strained against darkness broken only by gun flashes far to the north. What they could not see was the network that now defined modern naval warfare. Synchronized radar plots feeding into computers aboard 6 battleships and a dozen cruisers miles away. At 2:03, Coward's destroyers launched 27 torpedoes from the west, turning sharply away under fire. 2 minutes later, Kenyon's group fired another spread from the east. At least one struck Fuso, igniting fuel amidships. Japanese reports later described the ship breaking in half, though later analysis suggests she may have drifted burning for an hour before sinking. Either way, her guns fell silent. Oldendorf received the reports without comment. The system was working. At 2:20, radar operators aboard the West Virginia and Tennessee began tracking large, slow-moving targets emerging from the south. Bearing 160 degrees, range 22,800 yards. The plots aligned perfectly with destroyer sightings. The command to open fire when ready would come soon. But Oldendorf waited. His goal was order, not haste. On the Japanese bridge, Nishimura still believed he could break through. His ships advanced in column, unaware that their position was being resolved to the yard by unseen eyes. The next 10 minutes would erase any illusion of parity. At 2:35, the first firing solutions were locked in. The range closed to 20,000 yards. In the plotting rooms, mechanical computers whirred. Range clocks spun. Gun directors stabilized. The Americans had contact. Fire would come next. October 25, 1944. Northern mouth of Surigao Strait. At 2:38 in the morning, Admiral Oldendorf gave the quiet order. Open fire when ready. There was no fanfare, no signal flares, only radar bearings and firing keys waiting to be pressed. The first salvo came from the West Virginia. Her Mk8 radar had tracked the leading target for nearly 10 minutes, plotting bearing and range with precision that optical rangefinders could never match in darkness. 16-inch guns thundered in unison, followed seconds later by the Tennessee and California. Their shells arced over the water in long, invisible curves, descending on the Japanese line 20,000 yards away. From the Japanese perspective, the horizon erupted into daylight. The first rounds landed across Yamashiro's path, towering plumes marking each near miss. Within moments, radar corrections adjusted the pattern. The second salvo struck home. Fire control officers aboard the West Virginia noted range reduction and continued automatic tracking. Each solution refined every few seconds by the analog computer's gears and cams. What had once required visual spotting was now a mechanical rhythm. By 2:45, 5 American battleships were firing simultaneously. The air above the strait shimmered with the flash of propellant gases. Radar directed every broadside. Even through drifting smoke, the systems remained locked. Gunners could not see their targets, but they no longer needed to. Destroyers and cruisers joined the attack. The Denver, Portland, and Louisville fired rapid 8-inch salvos to rake the waterline, guided by SG radar. Shell splashes blended into one unbroken chain of detonations. Within 10 minutes, the Japanese formation began to dissolve. Yamashiro absorbed multiple hits, her forward turret still firing, but her speed dropping sharply. Communications broke down as fires swept through her superstructure. Onboard radar, rudimentary and short-ranged, failed completely under shock and heat. At 2:55, a final wave of torpedoes crossed the strait. Some came from destroyers already withdrawing northward, others from the Killen and Beale positioned near the center line. Their attack completed the pattern. Surface radar fixing range, destroyers feeding position reports, and gunfire adjusting by data relay rather than sight. It was an orchestrated convergence. an early glimpse of what networked warfare would become. For all its chaos, the operation was methodical. Each U.S. ship fired only as long as radar contact was firm. When splashes obscured the echoes, the fire control officers ceased until a new fix stabilized the target. Efficiency mattered more than noise. By 3 o'clock, Yamashiro was alone and burning. Her consorts, destroyers Shigure and Michishio, were scattered or sunk. The cruiser Mogami attempted to turn back, her radar and communications crippled. No Japanese guns now reached the American line. Oldendorf's doctrine had worked. Use information to trap, radar to kill, and fire discipline to finish. He had crossed the T perfectly. The sea glowed faintly from burning oil. Radar operators reported only fading echoes, some stationary, some drifting south. But one contact still moved, slow, uncertain, and closing. The Americans rechecked their screens. A crippled battleship was trying to fight its way back. October 25, 1944, Surigao Strait, Philippines. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the northern horizon glowed faintly, an unnatural dawn born of radar fire control. The American line of battleships, still invisible behind drifting smoke, fired methodically at targets they could not see. Each salvo came at 40-second intervals, each corrected automatically by radar echo returns. The Japanese column disintegrated under that invisible precision. Yamashiro attempted to turn south, her helm jammed and boilers failing. Her fire directors, blinded by smoke and flame, swung their guns toward the radar flashes that betrayed nothing. The sea around her churned white as 16-inch shells exploded in quick succession, walking up her deck from stern to bow. Within minutes, she listed heavily to port. Oldendorf's doctrine was holding, let radar lead, not human sight. To the west, the cruiser Mogami took hits from Portland and Louisville. Her superstructure was stripped away, and one engine room flooded. Yet her gunners continued to fire sporadically, shells falling far short of the American line. The radar-directed barrage was simply beyond reach. At 3:15, the West Virginia ceased fire temporarily. Radar echoes from the primary target had faded, replaced by faint, scattered contacts. It was unclear whether Yamashiro still moved or was drifting. Tennessee's operators confirmed. No speed trace, only debris returns. The flagship had been mortally struck. Aboard the Yamashiro, fires reached her aft magazines. Survivors later recalled a blinding white flash and a single upward roar. The ship capsized within minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Only a few dozen would be found alive by morning. At 3:25, radar screens showed the last major contact turning south at reduced speed. It was the Mogami, her navigation compromised. Oldendorf ordered cruisers to close range cautiously. The destroyers Melvin, McDermott, and McGowan moved ahead to finish the work. They launched torpedoes guided solely by radar bearings. One struck aft, sealing the cruiser's fate. The rest of Nishimura's force had ceased to exist as a coherent unit. When the last American salvo ended, the silence was total. Smoke and rain mingled into one gray curtain over the strait. Fires burned far to the south, their reflections flickering against the low clouds. The battle lasted less than 40 minutes. In that time, the U.S. Navy had conducted the first fully radar-controlled surface engagement in history. No visual range finding, no optical spotting, no star shells guiding aim. The machines had done the seeing, the plotting, and the killing. At 3:40, Oldendorf's ships shifted to ceasefire status. The command transmitted quietly across circuits. Cease firing. Maintain radar search. It was not a cheer, but a confirmation. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do. Far to the east, the faint rumble of guns still reached the beaches at Leyte. For soldiers there, the flashes on the horizon seemed like lightning. Few would realize they were watching the death of an entire fleet. The echoes faded from radar screens one by one, but beneath the calm surface, wrecks still burned and drifted. By dawn, the sea would reveal what radar had already known. October 25, 1944. Dawn over Surigao Strait. By first light, the storm clouds had thinned into long veils of mist. The smell of oil and cordite drifted across a sea littered with wreckage. Burnt timbers, life rafts, and fragments of steel rolled in the slow swell. Here and there, faint cries carried over the water. Survivors of the Japanese Southern Force clinging to debris that had once been ships of the line. The U.S. destroyers that had survived the night steamed cautiously southward. Radar operators tracked no more enemy returns, only clusters of metallic echoes from the surface. A few torpedoes still ran wild, their wakes white and useless. As the light grew, the scale of destruction became clear. The battleship Yamashiro was gone, broken in half, and sunk with nearly all hands. Fuso, already crippled earlier in the night, had also gone under. The cruiser Mogami lay dead in the water, still burning. Of the 7 destroyers that had entered the strait with Admiral Nishimura, only Shigur escaped, scarred but afloat, fleeing south toward Mindanao. For the Americans, losses were remarkably light. A handful of destroyers had been hit by return fire or near-miss shells, but none were sunk. Radar-directed coordination had kept them outside the effective range of Japanese guns for nearly the entire engagement. Oldendorf's flagship Louisville maintained a steady northward course through the strait, passing through the remains of the battle. Her radar screens were now quiet. Officers on deck watched burning fuel spread in thin iridescent sheets across the water. It was a grim victory. The mechanical precision of the night had left little room for valor or spectacle. By 6 o'clock in the morning, searchlights were switched off and gunnery circuits secured. Communications officers compiled contact reports, timing every engagement to the minute. The battle's timeline, reconstructed from radar logs, showed a near-perfect execution. Detection, engagement, and destruction within 40 minutes. The old battleships, many scarred from Pearl Harbor, had been reborn as instruments of calculated firepower. For the Japanese, the loss went beyond tonnage. Nishimura's southern force was intended to coordinate with another fleet approaching from the north. That plan had now collapsed. Without radio contact, the northern pincer advanced unaware that Surigao Strait was a graveyard. The doctrine of synchronized surface assaults, already obsolete, had been broken entirely by radar's reach. Survivors later described the experience as being attacked by ghosts. There was no visible enemy, no searchlights, no silhouettes, only explosions from nowhere. The mechanical nature of their destruction marked a turning point in naval warfare. At 7 o'clock, the first rescue boats began retrieving Japanese sailors. Few spoke. Most had been in the water for hours, faces blackened by oil. American crews recorded names where they could, noting ranks and ship names from fragments of uniforms. The scene at dawn was strangely quiet. Birds returned to the ridges, and the smoke drifted east with the wind. The radar operators who had guided the night's fire stood down from their posts. They had fought without ever seeing what they killed. The surface of the strait shimmered with fuel and wreckage, mute testimony to a new era of precision warfare. But for Oldendorf, the night's victory posed a deeper question. If machines could already fight with such perfection, what would happen when the range of sensors stretched even farther? The next battle would answer that. October 25, 1944. Midday, Leyte Gulf Operations Area. By noon, reports from Surigao Strait reached 7th Fleet Headquarters aboard the Blue Ridge. The data told a story without adjectives. Radar contact established at 16 minutes past midnight. Engagement completed by 3:40. 2 Japanese battleships destroyed. 1 cruiser crippled. Minimal U.S. losses. To commanders who had spent their careers in the era of optical rangefinders and flag signals, it was almost clinical in its efficiency. The analysis that followed focused not on courage, but on process. Oldendorf's victory had hinged on a system, an integrated network of sensors, communication links, and disciplined execution. Radar had stripped away uncertainty. The SG search sets provided early warning. The MK-8 fire control radars translated that data into bearing and range. The Ford instrument, Mark IA ballistic computers turned those numbers into firing solutions that compensated for wind, pitch, and target speed in real time. The human role had shifted from guesswork to supervision. Each step depended on timing. Destroyers engaged first to disrupt the Japanese formation. Their radar reports refined the position estimates used by the battleships further north. By the time the heavy guns opened fire, every variable, range, course, speed, had been updated several times over. It was the Navy's first true demonstration of distributed situational awareness. Contrast defined the outcome. The Japanese fleet fought under doctrines perfected in daylight and visual contact. They relied on centralized command and visual coordination, concepts that failed under night and weather. Without effective radar or secure radio networks, their formation lost cohesion at the first torpedo strikes. Nishimura's crews had courage but no data. Oldendorf's had data, and thus control. By early afternoon, U.S. analysts reconstructed the engagement minute by minute from radar logs. The precision was startling. Gunfire tracks showing changes in range measured in yards, bearings updated every few seconds, impact times accurate to the minute. It was warfare recorded as telemetry rather than memory. This efficiency, however, carried an unease. Veterans of older naval traditions wondered what it meant when battles could be fought without ever seeing the enemy. Heroism, once the measure of victory, now bowed to system design. The age of valor was giving way to the age of information. From a logistical perspective, the engagement also illustrated a broader transformation. Radar-enabled accuracy meant far less ammunition was required for decisive results. Battleships that once expended hundreds of shells in uncertain salvos could now disable a capital ship in minutes with a fraction of their magazines. That precision would soon guide not only naval guns but bombers, submarines, and eventually missiles. Surigao Strait became a template, a lesson written in bearings and signal returns. By evening, Oldendorf's ships were already resupplying ammunition and fuel, their fire control logs stored for study. The battle was over, but its implications were only beginning to be understood. Radar had proven not just its tactical worth, but its philosophical one. Whoever controlled the flow of information would control the future of war. And on the horizon, a new kind of engagement was already forming, where radar would no longer just guide guns, but entire fleets across oceans. October 26, 1944. Philippine Sea. The morning after the battle, the sea south of Leyte was calm again. The wrecks in Surigao Strait still smoldered beneath a thin mist, their oil slicks drifting toward Mindanao. The engagement was over, but its echoes were already moving through naval command networks, shaping doctrines that would define the next half-century. For the first time, the U.S. Navy had demonstrated that an entire surface action could be conducted through instruments rather than eyes. Every stage of the engagement, detection, targeting, fire correction, had been driven by data. Crews who never glimpsed the enemy had destroyed 2 battleships and crippled a third. The lessons were immediate and profound. Within weeks, after-action analyses circulated through fleet commands in Pearl Harbor and Washington. The findings emphasized process integration. Radar needed to be fused with communications, intelligence, and logistics into a single framework. This realization began the slow evolution from individual ship sensors to fleet-level combat information systems. By the war's end, the concept had a name: the Combat Information Center, or CIC. It was more than a room. It was a new way of thinking. Officers trained at radar scopes instead of rangefinders. Gunnery officers learned to trust analog computers over instinct. Commanders began to understand that information itself was a weapon, measurable and targetable. In the decades that followed, that principle would extend from the radar horizon to satellites and beyond. For Japan, Surigao Strait marked the end of the line for traditional surface doctrine. The Southern Force had been committed as part of a complex, multi-pronged plan. A plan that assumed communication delays and visual coordination could still win a modern battle. After Surigao, those assumptions collapsed. Japanese admirals no longer possessed the radar coverage or fuel reserves to adapt. The rest of the war would be fought under the shadow of that loss. The United States, meanwhile, absorbed the event as both victory and warning. The seamless radar gunnery that had annihilated Nishimura's fleet depended on perfect conditions: trained crews, disciplined radio silence, and secure coordination. The system worked because every element functioned precisely. Any failure in that chain, jammed signals, power loss, or operator error, could have undone the entire operation. In that sense, Surigao was both a triumph and trial run. By 1945, the lessons of the Strait were being applied at sea in new forms. Task Force 58's carrier operations adopted radar fighter direction. Submarines used radar to coordinate surface night attacks. The doctrine of crossing the T quietly faded from textbooks, replaced by networked engagement, a term not yet coined but already practiced. Decades later, when missile cruisers tracked targets across hundreds of miles, or satellites relayed strike data in seconds, the lineage traced back to a narrow Philippine passage where machines first turned night into day. Surigao Strait was not remembered for its glory. It was remembered for its geometry. Precise, silent, repeatable. A victory not of chance, but of systems aligned. In the end, the true legacy of that night was not the sinking of ships, but the arrival of an idea, that in modern war, the side that sees first and acts through data already holds the advantage. That idea still governs the seas.